Welcome to the BrightWord Books Podcast, where we bring you the stories behind today's most compelling authors and their work. In this episode, we are honored to feature Tom Francis Ramos, author of From Berkeley to Berlin, How the Rad Lab Helped Avert Nuclear War. Now, this is Tom's first appearance on the podcast, and he brings with him a remarkable background in nuclear science, national defense, and arms control. His book takes us inside the tense years of the Cold War, from the election of John F. Kennedy to the Berlin crisis of 1961. It traces the vital role of Ernest Lawrence and the Rad Lab physicists at Berkeley, who helped pioneer America's nuclear capabilities and ultimately provided the technology that enabled President Kennedy to stand firm against Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, thereby averting a potential nuclear war. Tom's career mirrors the weight of that history. A West Point graduate, former Army officer, physicist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and senior advisor at the Pentagon. He has spent his life at the intersection of science, security, and policy. So let's dive into his journey and the powerful story behind From Berkeley to Berlin. So Tom, it's wonderful to have you here with us today. It's lovely to meet you as well for the first time.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we've got some. I'm really looking forward to talking about your book because this gets into history, like the change of the world kind of history, if you know what I mean. Pivotal stuff here. We're talking about Khrushchev banging his shoe against the desk at the UN and all sorts of things like that. It's just great. So here we go. Right. First question for you then. Easy one to ease you into the podcast. What first inspired you to write From Berkeley to Berlin? Because it's the lesser known history of the Rad Lab that really you've brought to light, isn't it? So what made you do it?
Chris, I backed into it, if you want to know. I was asked by the associate director of the laboratory to write a history of an atomic bomb that the laboratory had designed and built back in the 1950s. And the purpose would be I was going to meet with the design physicists, these brand new young physicists, let them know this is the way things were done and this is why we did them that way. And in the course of doing that, I kept asking myself, well, how the hell did this come about? How did they do this? And I started doing more and more research. And then ended up, next thing I know, I'm writing about how the laboratory even got created in the first place. And the director loved it. I wasn't sure if he'd like it or not, but he loved it. And then he says, well, Tom, I want you to start giving lectures on this. And then I says, oh God, I better really make sure what I'm saying is correct. So I called up some of the principal characters that were in the 1950s. One was Harold Brown, who later became Secretary of Defense for Jimmy Carter. Johnny Foster, who became the Director for Defense Research, and then that's a number 3 spot in the Pentagon for 3 Secretaries of Defense. Mike May, who was a very, very prominent person contributing to arms control theory here in the United States. Anyway, all 3, got hold of the 3 of them. They had all been former directors of the laboratory, and all 3 agreed to meet with me, and they spent a couple of days going over the stuff. But it was Harold Brown at the end of our meeting said, Tom, you need to make this an unclassified book. And I smiled at him, said, yes, sir. And we were down in San Diego at the time. I flew back to Livermore, and the next day I was walking down the hallway and the elevator doors open up, and who steps out but the laboratory director at the time. He goes, Tom, when are you going to write that unclassified book? And I was like, shoot. I guess the gig is up. And so that started it, of course. And then Chris, to get to your point, to make this an unclassified book, I had to really concentrate more on the characters, on the people, and less on the gadgets that they were doing. And what was the politics? What was going on at this time? Finally, I'd like to say the biggest hero in this is my grandmother and my mother. My grandmother is an Irish immigrant. She was born and raised in Ireland. And it's what she was what the Irish called a Shawnee, a storyteller. And as I was growing up, my mother worked all the time. So she was just always working. So I grew up with my grandmother, who I called Nanny. And my grandfather was Dada. And he was from Dublin. And anyway, and so when I was growing up to speak English, it's, oh, Tommy, let me tell you, when I was a little girl and then working O'Connell's years, that's the way I spoke English. And when I got to West Point, I didn't think I had an accent, but I was very quickly informed I was not speaking the King's English. And So the army kind of switched me over a bit. But anyway, my grandmother infused into me that if I'm going to write anything, I need to make it a story. And so when I thought about what I was doing, I needed a hero, and that I came to the conclusion had to be Ernest Lawrence. Lawrence was the hero. He is so undervalued by historians. Seriously, I could go on forever on how he is, but he was a key person working with a key person in the UK. It was Mark Oliphant, who I don't think many people in the UK know who Mark Oliphant is. Uh, I call Oliphant the Lawrence of England, but the two of them were instrumental, really key into getting the Allies to start an atomic program. Contrary to the Oppenheimer movie and all the other crap, they were very key. They worked very closely together, and then my story proceeded from then. And sad to say, Oppenheimer does pop up in the story. And in fact, if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, every character in that movie is in my book. I talk about them all. And I do disagree with, like, Christopher Nolan was the publisher, and he has a trailer, and he says, well, the whole idea of the atomic bomb started with Oppenheimer. And when I give lectures to people who want to know about the book, I said, no, that's not true. I said, in fact, the real brains was not a man, it was a woman, a small, frail woman, 98 pounds. She's buried in England, but she was from Vienna. She was a Jew, and her name is Lisa Meitner. She was the mastermind. She's the one who came up with the theory of nuclear fission over 4 days. So she was a phenomenal person. But anyway, and I would go on and I went on from that. But Oppenheimer more was an obstacle to Oppenheimer was pushing, and in the book I go through all the positions he took, and it was not really good advice. He went through some grand character change after they developed the atomic bomb, and even told the people at Los Alamos that it was immoral to do this, and there became a fracture and a distancing. Oppenheimer worked for Lawrence at the Rad Lab. Lawrence created the Rad Lab back in 1931. And there was a distancing. And Oppenheimer really took on a lot of communist type of activities. Well, his wife, his mistress, his brother, they were all card-carrying communists. And Oppenheimer lied to security personnel about attempts of the Communist Party to get secrets from him during the war. So there was clearly something was not right. And there was a separation that went on. So he became an obstacle for Lawrence and people that were trying to push for the defense of the free world. And my villain is Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev. He was a thug. And so that became the core of the story. I'm sorry. And then in the course of that, I introduced what I call upstarts. Not that they disrupted things, but they took up the baton from Lawrence. And just as Lawrence had pushed the United States into an atomic program in World War II, so too they were very instrumental in getting the country prepared for the Cold War following that. So there you go. That's much more than you wanted, but that's kind of what happened behind the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating. I mean, there's so many things to unpick there. I mean, the thing about Oppenheimer and what you just said about starting to feel, well, saying he was guilty, he felt guilty about it, and they didn't really know whether it was it reminded me of Alfred Nobel, okay, with his dynamite, right? And also, who was the guy that invented nitrogen?
Nitroglycerin?
No, is it nitroglycerin? Yeah, it could have been actually, but then no, that was Alfred Nobel. No, that was TNT. But anyway,
he invented dynamite.
dynamite.
Nobel.
That's it. Yeah, and so of course, because of his guilt and the huge amount of money he made, that's why we have the Nobel Prize, isn't it? The Nobel Institute and everything. And so I always wondered whether that sort of like followed on from there. So in other words, Oppenheimer is seen as the person who created, the Manhattan Project and everything else. So anyway,
I'm sorry, it's a mystery. He was Jewish, and he really did. In the movie, they had him where he was going to poison his teacher, and in the movie they say he backed off. And in real life, no, he didn't back off. He actually, poor guy got really sick, and his teacher was a Nobel laureate, and he got really, really sick. Scotland Yard was out to arrest him. They were about to arrest him for attempted murder, and when his mother came over and took him out of Cambridge, and she took him to Germany, and he got his PhD at Göttingen in Germany, working there, and that he was introduced to the fascism of Germany at the time, and he became very anti-fascist. Now, whether that's when he really got the socialist leaning, because he very clearly became a communist sympathizer, if you will, back in Berkeley. What the origins of that could be a mystery, but clearly he was a very passionate man. He was not middle of the road in any which way, and so he was very passionate to develop that atom bomb, but he was also very passionate not to develop anything further. And my theory is that, well, this is a socialist government, that they're not going to be as evil as a fascist government. And what I also bring out is some of the biggest critics of Oppenheimer were Eastern European Jews. Von Neumann, Eugen Wigner, Keringen, the great even Ulam, Stanislav Ulam from Poland, and George Gamow from Odessa, from Ukraine. They became his greatest critics. So it was not some anti-Semitism by any means. It was just he felt really intimidated by fascism, but seemed to be okay with socialism coming in. And I don't think he fully realized how evil Stalin was. And as I bring out my book, Stalin killed more Ukrainians than Hitler executed Jews. I mean, so the guy was evil, really evil. And for some reason, whatever reason, Oppenheimer never seemed to absorb that. Lawrence did. Lawrence fully understood we got a real threat coming. And so that's why they came to odds.
And hence, as you say, preparing for the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Also, the other thing that you mentioned again, I suppose that it seems that these people are always in these projects. So you're talking about the human computer there, the lady that actually came up with the theory you mentioned.
Neumann's wife. Oh no, I'm sorry, Lisa Meitner. Yeah, she was a phenomenal physicist. She won the Leibniz Prize in Germany, which is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. Wonderful mind. In the Solvay conferences in Belgium, in Brussels, we had the greatest physicists would meet about every year or two. You can see pictures of her, and she's sitting right next to Einstein and Schrödinger and Heisenberg. She was pretty well known within that tight circle of world-class physicists. Not well known, she was not a Marie Curie. She was not as well known, let's say, as Marie Curie, but she was sharp. She was a hell of an intellectual.
It shows you, well, in that case, then I've used that human computer term incorrectly, then, really, because she wasn't just a number cruncher, right? So,
she was a great theoretician.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Well, I mean, as we've been saying, many people obviously know about the Manhattan Project, but fewer, including myself, know very little about the Rad Lab's role in the Cold War. I mean, how did its work differ? Why did it exist, and why was it so pivotal?
It came about. What crystallized it was when the Russians detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, and they became a nuclear power. And Americans, and I suspect many Western Europeans, became comfortable with the status. But suddenly, Stalin having his hands on an atomic bomb, it was kind of throwing cold water in your face. And during the Manhattan Project, physicists like Lawrence knew that during the war, it was Enrico Fermi, the great Italian physicist, had really introduced the idea of, well, why can't you use an atomic bomb to create fusion reactions and make a bigger explosion? And this is based on research that was done by two Russians in the 1930s, in which they came up with a theory of how did the sun operate? How did the sun create all this energy? And the answer, the clue was fusion, where you fuse together the nuclei. So it was the opposite of fission, where you're splitting apart the nucleus. Now you're fusing it together, and they showed this is how it could work. But you need a lot of heat. You need a lot of energy to fuse things together. And so Fermi's question was, could you use that heat to then create fusion, make more energy? And the question he asked this question of his good friend Edward Teller. Teller and Fermi had met back in 1933, and they had collaborated, worked together. They enjoyed each other's company, and that became an obsession with Edward Teller the rest of his life, answering Fermi's question. And so when he arrived at Los Alamos, and he had a long discussion with Oppenheimer that he wanted to start a program to create a fusion bomb, and Teller had an idea. He called it the Super. And finally, they had an argument, but finally Oppenheimer allowed Edward to go ahead and form a small group. And during World War II, they didn't make much progress, to be honest with you. Fermi gave 5 lectures during the war on what the requirements were to make a fusion bomb work. Richard Feynman got involved in some of the calculations. Some of these guys got involved, but nothing much happened. And then Oppenheimer dropped the program, told Teller shut it down. And so when the war ended, Teller left Los Alamos and went to Chicago with Fermi. But then immediately the new director, a guy named Norris Bradbury at Los Alamos, offered Teller a contract to restart the super program back at Los Alamos. Teller accepted, came back, and then he started a conference in 46 in which he said, we can do this, we can do this. And he was pretty much overly optimistic because this was incredibly difficult. This is not something like the atom bomb where you just put together a critical mass of material and it blows up. Excuse me, this one, you really got to work hard to make something. You got to basically make a sun. You got to make the sun operating in an object the size of a soccer ball. I mean, this is a really big challenge. And anyway, in 1949-50, the British arrested a physicist by the name of Klaus Fuchs. And they found out he was a Soviet spy, and they realized everything we all knew, the Manhattan Project knew about nuclear explosives, Stalin knew about too, through the spy. And it was more than Klaus Fuchs, but he was the main one. And so Lawrence went back to Washington and tried to convince the government that we have a threat steamrolling towards us with Stalin, just as much as 10 years earlier, we had a possible threat with Hitler possessing an atomic bomb by himself. So too, it was not good to have Stalin with a hydrogen bomb all by himself. A hydrogen bomb would be about 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. And that caused a real separation. And Oppenheimer, excuse me, Congress by this time had created the Atomic Energy Commission, which took the power of controlling nuclear weapons away from the military. They wanted civilian control. And Oppenheimer drew a really prestigious position within the Atomic Energy Commission, and he used that position to stop what we call thermonuclear research, that is, research on a hydrogen bomb. And it was frustrating Lawrence and others because they felt, rightfully it turns out, that the Russians would suddenly show up. And it turns out after the wall came down, we had records from the Kremlin that in 1946, the Russians did indeed start a hydrogen bomb program under a Nobel laureate by the name of Tom. And the first thing Tom did was he recruited a physicist named Andrei Sakharov, who became the father of the Russian hydrogen bomb. So the Russians were way after this. Lawrence was right. We really did need to worry about it. And Oppenheimer simply was throwing wrenches into this. Finally, a commissioner from the Atomic Energy Commission flew out to Berkeley, met with Lawrence and said, Professor Lawrence, we need you to start another laboratory. This would be the third one. Lawrence, by the way, created the MIT Radiation Lab, which developed the British radar during World War II. So he's always in the center of things. But anyway, Lawrence agreed, we need to inject energy. And Los Alamos, which was greatly affected by Oppenheimer's prestige, seemed to be not so passionate about this. And Lawrence said, we need something more passionate. And they said, we need you to start something. And so he said, okay. And basically he went around looking at military posts around Berkeley. And he came to the Livermore Naval Air Station with Louis Alvarez was his buddy. And he went in there, and according to Alvarez, the Navy had an Olympic-sized swimming pool, an indoor swimming pool. And Lawrence walks in, looks at the swimming pool, looks at Alvarez and says, Louis, we got a home. And so when people ask me, how did Livermore end up being a nuclear weapons laboratory? It was the pool. But anyway, he starts a laboratory in Livermore that should emphasize thermonuclear research, and they do. And as I show in the book, it has a horrible start. They have 3 failures. They recruit Edward from Chicago, get him back from Chicago, and they put him in charge because he was the only one who had experience in this. And his ideas were not great. And so we had 3 failures. And then again, as I bring in a book, and this is very, very unique. I don't think many people, they didn't have access to a lot of top secret documents. But what I realized, what was unique, was that the failures of Edward, as well as right at this time was the hearing, the Oppenheimer hearing going on in Washington, in which uh, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover went to President Truman, I'm sorry, President Eisenhower, and Eisenhower ordered the Atomic Energy Commissioner to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance because of his actions. And then it was Oppenheimer that demanded a hearing to clear his name. And at that, the commissioner wanted witnesses to show how he had botched up thermonuclear research. And of course, that meant he went back to Berkeley and Livermore now. And so the witnesses were going to be Lawrence, Edward Teller, Louis Alvarez, a man named David Griggs. And the stress of having to testify against his old friend caused Lawrence, the night before he was going to testify on national TV, he was so stressed out at a dinner, he had to step away, went to the bathroom and started vomiting up blood. And he had a colitis attack. His brother, who was a doctor, he called up his brother. His brother ordered him immediately get back to Berkeley, and Lawrence was hospitalized with colitis. And then Edward did get on. He got on national TV, and for that performance of testifying against Lawrence, I'm sorry, against Oppenheimer, who by now was a national hero, the father of the atom bomb, and that. And so people were accusing him of being a McCarthyist, if you will, of the era. And that so stressed out Edward that he also came down with a colitis attack and he got hospitalized. And so two very young men, 28-year-old Harold Brown and a 32-year-old Johnny Foster, took over the weapons program laboratory, and they met together for a few weeks, and then they wrote a document that went out to the scientists at the lab. And I spoke to some of them, and they said, yeah, we got this document. And Johnny Foster and Harold Brown told the laboratory, basically, we're abandoning Edward Teller's ideas. We're going to come up with brand new ideas. They did, and what they came up with was revolutionary. And as I go through in my book, what they accomplished within the next 2 to 3 years changed the course of the Cold War, and which would eventually lead to nuclear warheads that could actually deter Khrushchev from, Khrushchev wanted to take over Western Europe, very much like he was a Putin on steroids, if you will. And you needed something to deter him. And what happened is what those young, I call them upstarts, what those young upstarts came up with. And it was a British Nobel laureate said, you can't do what they were about to do. He said, you can't do it. But they did accomplish it. And of course, in the classified documents, I get to look at what they did. And I remember as a physicist, Jesus, what the hell were they thinking? I mean, this is crazy stuff. So I'm sorry, in the book, I couldn't do it. I spent weeks with classification officers, trying to explain, but I got to explain, this is really crazy. And I had to use all sorts of, I'll give you one example.
Yeah, please, because you're just dangling this here.
I know I'm all that excitement from years ago is coming back.
Yeah.
But I would have the word thermal equilibrium, for example. And they said, no, Tom, that's top secret. So I literally crossed out thermal equilibrium and I said, they reached the same temperature. And they said, okay, that's okay. So it's like, well, these guys were not physicists, but it's almost as though they said F equals MA is top secret, something we all learned in high school. It was top secret, and I was going nuts trying to figure out what were the correct words I was supposed to be using. But anyway, it came about, and that's when I fell in love with these characters. There's these Johnny Fosters, Mike Mays. These young, very young men. What they accomplished was remarkable, just remarkable, and it changed the course of it. And even John F. Kennedy was smart enough to realize these guys made a difference. Which, as you mentioned at the end of the book, he goes back out to Berkeley to thank these guys, to just thank. And I asked Mike May, who was one of the first ones he met, Mike, what was it like meeting President Kennedy? And Mike May was born in France, in Marseille. He was a tiny guy, about 5'6", and weighed about 100 pounds. And he got drafted into World War II. He grew up in Hanoi because his father was a surgeon in Hanoi, but then the Japanese are coming, so they end up emigrating to Walla Walla, Washington, of all things. And Mike gets drafted, and he volunteers to be an airborne infantryman, and he's in a regiment that's going to jump into Japan for the invasion of Japan. And and I mean, these guys carry 100-pound packs. I'm looking at Mike. I said, and I was an airborne ranger in the Army. And I looked at Mike and I said, Mike, for God's sake, they would have killed you. I said, those 2 atom bombs saved your life. And he thought about it. He says, yeah, Tom, you're probably right. So these guys were just remarkable, and what they achieved. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going too much too fast, but I fell in love with these guys. And when Mike again said, well, what was it like meeting President Kennedy? He says, well, Tom, he came into the lobby of the Rad Lab. He stepped across, big, broad smile on his face. He stuck his hand out and shook my hand and said, thank you so much for what you've done. He said, it was the proudest day of my life. And I said, man, I realized I need to tell their story.
Yeah, yeah. Imagine that. That would have been incredible, wouldn't it? But
Yeah.
okay, so you have mentioned these great
Sorry.
things that they've created, but you haven't
Yes.
actually told us anything. But if you know what I mean, and I realize obviously through classification it makes it difficult. But I mean, is there a way that you can give us an idea of something? Because you know that they created that really did work to help America to deter this Soviet threat.
Yes, I can. And I bring this out. This is a big major theme in the book.
Hmm.
At the time, Rand Corporation, which was created by the Air Force, General Arnold, it had these nationally ranked policy analysts like Herman Kahn, who wrote on thermonuclear war, and he was the caricature of Dr. Strangelove in the movie, was Herman Kahn.
Mm.
He lived in Livermore. He came out to Livermore, started working at Livermore. These guys belonged to Rand Corporation. Bill Kaufman, Bernard Brody, Albert Wohlstetter. These were super giants.
Yeah.
And they came out. And as I mentioned, one of the legacies of Lawrence was the way he managed systems. It was very easy to embed these policy analysts into there. Anyway, what they were worried about was that in order for your nuclear weapons stockpile to be credible, to deter a guy like Khrushchev, it needed to be able to survive any kind of attack so that the threat of retaliation was always there. Otherwise, it's not credible, and all you're doing is inviting an attack. And then what they pointed out to the physicists at Livermore is, if you really want to make these things survivable, they got to be a lot smaller than they are now. Your weapons are way too big. The Air Force had to invent a bomber, the B-34, which is so big it could carry one bomb, which weighed 46,000 pounds. And in fact, in the movie Dr. Strangelove, that's the bomb that Slim Pickens rides down to the ground at the end of the It's a huge bomb.
Yeah.
And they were saying it's not survivable because, well, the bombs are all stored in the United States and the UK. The UK air bases also had some. And the Soviets knew exactly where all these bombs were. And so Rand Corporation did a year-long study. What if the Russians, if they intent on invading Germany and then go on into France and the rest of Western Europe, what if they just secretly flew over each strategic air base and dropped an atom bomb? And they would destroy all the airplanes there. And that's it. In one fell swoop, it'd be like a nuclear Pearl Harbor, and the entire deterrent force would be wiped out. So that was the thesis. And then they did a year of war games, and they came and they told the Pentagon, you know, they could do it. They could do it. And that started fierce debates that the weapons had to be much smaller and on various platforms. And it was Admiral Ollie Burke, who was a World War II hero, came up with the idea, well, what if we put them on submarines? We'll put our weapons on submarines, launch them. You can't sneak attack a submarine. But the problem was, in order to fit inside these the weapons had to be much smaller. I mean, 3 or 4 times smaller. That was the challenge I mentioned. And so from the get-go, having these policy analysts embedded with the physicists, the Livermore test were designing weapons much smaller than what was going on at Los Alamos. And I was at Los Alamos. When I was in the Army, so I don't mean to, I mean, they're smart. Los Alamos is a great institution. But up to that time, they pretty much had a monopoly, you know, and you know, a B-29 bomber dropping a bomb in Japan, that worked. And so there was not much pressure. But at Livermore, there was a huge amount of pressure to make the damn thing smaller so they're survivable. And so the tests that were being done in Livermore in the middle 50s, 1955, 56, each one was setting a record for being the smallest thing. And to keep it unclassified, by 1956, 57, Livermore had already tested something, a thermonuclear weapon that was less than 1,000 pounds. That's 3 or 4 times smaller than the smallest weapon. And so when Admiral Burke had his conference at Nopska, it's called, Edward was able to stand up and say, in his Hungarian accent, we can give you a warhead for your fleet ballistic missile in 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Burke asked Carson Mark, who was there from Los Alamos, he says, well, can you guys do that? And Mark says, it's never been done, and it's going to take more than 5 years to do it. And so Burke he looks at Teller and he goes, you got a deal. And so suddenly we were on a hook, but we were prepared. And within 16 months, we had a weapon. And within 24 months, the USS George Washington, the first Polaris submarine, was launched, carrying 16 Polaris missiles with 16 Livermore warheads. And these things, that weapon system was a leapfrog jump. And we had a totally survivable deterrent that nobody could threaten. And I have pictures of Kennedy watching these Polaris launches. And I have a letter that he wrote to the admiral in charge of the program. He says, this changes the whole scene of nuclear deterrence. This really changes everything. And he admitted to his national security staff, this gives me the backbone to stand up to this thug, because Khrushchev was threatening every capital in Western Europe with what he called a super bomb. And he was, the guy was a thug, and he was really more like Putin. He's threatening to use these atom bombs all over the place. And Kennedy decided he was going to stand up to him. But he admits that it was the breakthrough, that technical breakthrough that gave us a weapon that could survive a sneak attack from the Soviets. And that happened at Livermore. I just gave you the whole gist and theme of the book. That was the miracle, if you will, or the great success that happened.
Well, Tom, I mean, that's fascinating because, of course, you've got the iconic photos of Polaris, right, with the black and white nose cones and all this stuff. And I guess as well, it's made me think about how that was the nascent space race as well, I guess, wasn't it? Because it was all coming up before that. And so I guess, sorry, go on.
The Beatles. I mean, I went back and thinking about it myself. What the hell was I thinking while all this was going on? It was the Beatles. I mean,
yeah.
But so, you're right. This was all of this in Alan Shepard. Yeah. That's when he made the flight into outer space, the right stuff kind of stuff. All these things were happening. That's when Kennedy gave his speech that we would have a man on the moon, by the end of the decade. All that happened in 61. But right in the middle of it, he meets Khrushchev in Vienna. And Khrushchev gives him an ultimatum. You get out of Berlin in 6 months because we're coming in, and I will not be responsible for any Americans that get killed. And Kennedy, I have a picture. His face is white after that meeting. And then I read the testimony after he was assassinated. The Kennedy Center, about a year or two later, actually interviewed every member of the National Security Council, including McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor. And these are exhaustive interviews. Each and every one says the Berlin crisis was the big deal. Cuba gets the big name because Kennedy gets up there, pounds his chest, and says and everybody knows about it. And I remember watching it on TV. It was scary. They all admitted, but by that time they knew that Khrushchev would back down because what they went through a year earlier. They said, but Berlin had everyone worried. And as I also mentioned, that's when Kennedy was giving executive orders to build fallout shelters. I remember as a kid, I grew up in New York City, going to Macy's, and they're building a fallout shelter in the basement of Macy's. And what the hell's, all right. I had no idea that was a presidential order. And these things are being built all over the country. And all of us are, we were all cheering for the Beatles. We weren't thinking about a thermonuclear war. No, but that's what was happening in the background.
And you can still see those public signs sometimes as well. I've seen them, heading for the.
You see that fallout shelter sign. They all were built in 61.
Yeah, incredible. Wow. I mean, honestly, it's such a time. And it's fascinating talking to you about this. It really is because, you think about Polaris being obviously really something, but then also think about all those fields in the Midwest being dug up and silos being built right?
Yes.
And those Minutemen missiles and all of that stuff, all happening at the same time as well, pretty much. Really, is that right?
Well, Chris, the Air Force, Bernie Schriever, he was a general. It was the father of the ICBMs. He was the guy trying to get the Air Force away from bombers, big bombers, and using these ICBM missiles. Anyway, he was looking at what happened with the Navy. And the problem he had was in order to put a missile below the ground, he also needed to make these things much smaller and faster. If you had a liquid fueled missile, it took at least a half an hour from the time you said launch. Then they had to raise it up, they had to put the fuel in, and so good luck surviving an attack. So he realized he needed to have a solid fuel missile, and there's less energy. And Werner von Braun, who was by this time working for the Americans, said, you can't do it with solid fuel. There's not enough energy to get it. But they did. The Air Force watched the Navy. The Navy produced these missiles for Polaris, in which Bernie Schriever said, shoot, that's a good idea. And so he came up, and Minuteman being, this thing can go off in a minute. They used a lot of the Navy technology, and he went to Livermore, and Bernie Schriever also goes, and I later talking with Johnny Foster, Johnny said, oh, Bernie's a good friend. But Schriever comes in and says, we need you to develop now a weapon for a new Air Force missile, which will be the Minuteman. So the warhead that goes in the Minuteman is a direct successor as the warhead that went in Polaris. I mean, so not only did it revolutionize the Navy, it revolutionized the Air Force. Now, so suddenly we have Minuteman fields, like you said. Now we have these silos going off. But again, to get them into these silos, these weapons, and to make them go off in a minute, you needed a lot of what the Navy had been developing in Polaris, and the Air Force adopted it. And part of that adopting was the Livermore warhead. So yeah, it played a big role. By 1962, 63, practically every major strategic system is now coming out of Livermore, which is amazing when you think about it. Like I bring it out the book, that just 10 years earlier, everything they did was a flop. These 20-year-olds, they were a bunch of 20-year-olds. And I had to think, how the hell did all that happen? And I came up with three attributes. One was Lawrence's leadership and his management system, the way he managed things. The second thing was what I call a computer culture. When I arrived at Livermore, as I mentioned, I had been to Los Alamos, but it was a distinctly different culture. My group leader, as George mentioned, who'd been a Holocaust survivor. As a kid, he was in Vienna, and he just escaped. He was a Jew. But anyway, George gave me a big lecture. He says, here in Livermore, we're not the Edison laboratory. We're not going to test 1,000 filaments to come up with a light bulb. Here, we're going to understand the physics of it, and then we're going to model it on a computer, and then only do we test yes, George, kind of thing. But it was like a religion. Everything you did, so a lot of us wrote computer codes. We wrote models. It was the way. And when you do that, if you think about it now, Chris, think back in the 50s, and you're a Nobel laureate, fresh out of Europe, and now you're working on the atomic bomb program. And I come up to you with a box of wires, and I said, look, this box of wires can think a hell of a lot faster than you can, and it's smarter than you. And you would smile at me and tell me, go back home. But back in the 1950s, computer science was this brand new science. And to many of these distinguished physicists, there was like, you had these 20-year-old coming in telling me to trust a bunch of wires that he can think better than I can. But the thing at Livermore was, instead of these big, well-known physicists trained in Europe, they started out with very young experimentalists coming out of the Rad Lab, who were psychotronians, they call themselves. They were just experimentalists, and they were much, much more trusting of this brand new computer science and willing to trust what the computer calculations they did. And that allowed them to, if you will, that was one of the reasons they could leap forward. They utilized those machines, and it took a while for the rest of the world to catch up, but they just jumped into it, and it paid off. And of course, they had von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. He's living in Livermore. And I spoke like Mike May. I said, Mike, how was your first week at Livermore? How did it start? He said, well, I got introduced. And he says, and then I was tapped on the shoulder, and it was Professor von Neumann. He says, Mike, I want you to write a computer code on radiative transport for a hydrogen bomb. Now, this is the physics of how a hydrogen bomb. And Mike says, yes, sir. And he went back to his office and he pulled out a textbook and he started writing computer, based on these physics equations. And I said, Mike, that's something you give to a team of physicists and it'll take them a year. I said, what the hell were you thinking? He says, Tom, I just got my PhD and I figured that's what PhDs must do. He said, I didn't know any better. But Mike wrote a code in machine language. There were no Fortrans, nothing like that.
Oh,
He
right.
wrote a code in machine language, and it became the backbone of the Livermore computer codes, which were the greatest in the world. That's how Mike May was. That's what I mean. These guys were super. Mike made that fresh, brand new PhD, and he writes a computer code that will last for half a century. So if you get an idea then what these guys were, how talented these guys were, and how lucky we were.
Yeah, and again with the code, I think that if I'm not mistaken here, I mean, without subroutines and as you were saying, they're writing it raw, right? And
Oh, if you never, I'm afraid I'm old enough. But when I took my first computer course in college, I had to do a homework problem, and the question was add 5 plus 2 and print out the answer. Well, hell, first you had 10 registers, and first you had a binary, make a binary number of the number 5. Then you had to place it into a particular location inside the computer. Then I had to do a binary thing. Then I had to binarily add the two things in another register, and then put the answer in this register. And then it would take hours to
yeah.
5 plus 2 equals 7. Yes, that's what Mike and some of these other giants were doing at the time. They were writing sophisticated computer codes in that kind of language, and that astounded me. Because I'm well aware of how difficult that is, not having a compiler like
Uh,
Fortran to work with. I mean,
uh,
holy God, what were you guys thinking?
exactly, it's just out of this world, isn't it? I mean, my first computer use was with BASIC on a TRS-80 from Radio Shack, right? And
Oh,
at the end of the day, I still didn't know it, but now I understand what's behind that. Obviously we all know about operating systems to a certain extent, but in those for you, registers and all that jazz is just amazing. Anyway, sorry, I've gone off topic, so I'll go back in. So,
okay.
so when we're talking about Berlin, now was it not Churchill that said something about the Iron Curtains now coming down to do with Berlin? So how did the Polaris missile then? I mean, actually, I think you've already explained this in the fact that you've got a survivable deterrent that actually meant that, Khrushchev would have to think twice. Because, yeah, quite rightly, as you mentioned earlier on, all you've really got to do, basic bottom line stuff, is just take out the airfields, right? Where these massive bombs were stored. So how did Khrushchev respond to that? Because not many of us really know the ins and outs of this, do we?
I think now some of this I have read. He wrote a autobiography, Khrushchev Remembers. So I did go to that. I wanted to get inside his head as much as I could. And it's rough. The Khrushchev, he was during World War II, he was the political commissar of the Central Soviet Army, working directly for Stalin. I mean, he reported directly back to Stalin. And part of his theater of operations was Stalingrad. And so all of the orders, like, for example, during the battle, they didn't have enough weapons for all the Soviet soldiers. He ordered you go, and every third soldier was given a rifle. And if he got shot, then it was up to one of the other two to pick up the rifle and keep going.
Right.
Any Russians that retreated, went backwards, then there were Russian machine gunners would kill them, kind of thing. And all those rules and the way all of that happened was Khrushchev coming up with this stuff. He was a thug. He was a really rough thug. And when Stalin dies, of course, among the Politburo, you had these very, very, what's Beria, and all these other really tough individuals vying for the position. And Khrushchev wins. That tells you, he's not a wuss.
Mm.
But nevertheless, he has a Politburo, and he fully realizes if he shows any kind of weakness, they're going to act the way he would act and get rid of the guy, and let's get somebody in there that can do stuff. And it was also, they were inheriting Stalin's ethos. And Stalin and Khrushchev shows this. He really was, in a sense, a revolutionary, a believer. He was a believer in world communism. We're going to do this. We're going to get this. And by 49, China, that's when Mao Zedong takes over in China. And so it was, you're right, Churchill at the University of Missouri, or in Fulton, Missouri, is when he gave that speech where he said an iron curtain has come down over Europe, separating the free from the communist. Now in 49, people are saying now there's a bamboo curtain just came up in which surrounds China. So we got the iron curtain on one side, we got a bamboo curtain on the other. And it looked like the world was going to, that these prophecies of the world being taken over by communism, God, you had one success after another happening. And Stalin definitely had his mindset on Europe. And the big thorn in his side was Berlin. Right. Berlin was being used, it was a free city in a sense, and many East Germans would slip into East Berlin and then just cross over to West Berlin. Once they're in West Berlin, go to Tempelhof Airport and catch a flight to West Germany, and then they were free. Mm-hmm. And the hemorrhaging of East Germans was very serious, and it was an embarrassment in that. And Stalin, of course, back in 48, tried to shut down Berlin and all that. We had the Berlin airlift, all that, trying to stop this hemorrhaging going on. And so Khrushchev had to prove to the Politburo and for his survivability, he had to show that he was another Stalin, if you will. And so from 1957, 58, he was determined. I need to get rid of Berlin. Berlin needs to be the capital of East Germany, period. None of this West Berlin crap. Mm. He visits President Eisenhower in 58. If you might remember, he goes to Disneyland. He visits Disneyland, and they have a picture of him having a Mickey Mouse kind of ice cream cone. And then, I do remember this. I was a teenage boy at the time, but the headlines on our newspapers, Khrushchev gives us this big talk, and he says, "We will bury your grandchildren. The world's going to be communist. Get it, accept it. We will bury your grandchildren." And yes, and you're right. Later at the UN, he even takes off his shoe, which was a Slavic sign of disrespect, and he bangs his shoe on the desk, kind of that. So I mean, I think part of it, his psyche was he needed to be a strong man. He had to do this and that's how he got to power. And he just judged other people the way he judged himself, the way he acted. He figured other people are going to act, and unless I'm strong. So, he wanted Berlin, and he was sick and tired. And with Eisenhower, he kept getting frustrated. But then Kennedy gets elected, and in Khrushchev, he writes in his biography, he says, well, Eisenhower had been the commander of the European theater. He's a big foresight general and all. But now we had a PT boat commander, young 44-year-old PT boat commander. He said, I can take him. And he said, I can take this guy. And so he arranges with Kennedy, they're going to meet face-to-face in Vienna. And that's when Khrushchev is just going to hammer him on the head and tell him, get out of Berlin. I'm tired of all this arguing and everything. Get out, and I will not. The Red Army is going to invest the city, and I'm not going to be responsible. We had the Berlin Brigade. We had 1,000 American troops there. I won't be responsible for any Americans get killed. It's not my problem. And Kennedy had to believe him, for good reason. Khrushchev was a thug, so Kennedy took it seriously. That's when he goes back to Washington. He tells the staff, "We're going to have a thermonuclear war in 6 months." But the one thing about Kennedy was he was not going to give an inch. He was going to stand up to him, which is so important. And I'm sorry, I promise not to get into politics, but when Putin, raises the nuclear word, it just seemed to me many of our leaders would, oh, no, and they'd step back. And we don't want to, like the Obama administration, we would not send anything but food stamps to Ukraine. And Biden did very much, and all that did was encourages Putin, and his stock goes way up. He gets more and more popular, kind of thing. And God bless us, but Kennedy had enough wherewithal that with a bully like that, you have to stand up to him. If you begin to cave in, he just gets bigger and bigger, kind of thing. And so Kennedy knew, he says, I'm not going to give an inch. We're going to stand up to these guys. And so that was scary because Kennedy knew that by saying that to his national security staff, he said, we are going to have a thermonuclear war. And he was prepared. He says, yep, they're going to, any moment now, get ready, a hydrogen bomb's going to come down. But that took a hell of a lot of guts. I mean, how do you portray that? You know, that's what's welling up in my mind. How do I put that in writing? How do I put that for someone who was born long after these events took place? How could they possibly know how goddamn scary it was in the 60s? You know, those
Well,
movies where many of us were going underneath our desks in our schoolrooms. I was one of them. I distinctly remember I went to Catholic school, so we had nuns. You did not screw up with the nuns.
no.
If the nun told you to get under the desk, you got under the desk. And and I was one of those, and we would have these airy exercises going, and you kind of had this feeling, yeah, there's some terrible thing would come on. But as a child, you don't realize this was very, very, very serious. Really
Yeah.
serious.
So Tom, how close do you think we actually came to that then in Berlin?
I think really close. I think that the fact that Kennedy was able to parade those submarines and make it known to, and Khrushchev knew damn well. And what was kind of a shock, I think, to Khrushchev was that he called in 1958, he called for the test ban. And I think the reason they did that is that they had a hydrogen bomb like we had a hydrogen bomb. So we had reached parity. And suddenly in 1960, we come out with a submarine loaded. I mean, at the time, that was considered impossible. You can't do that. That's too small. But the United States did it. And we tested it, and they all work. Everything works. And that was a shock. I think that shocked Khrushchev that suddenly we had this ability that he didn't have, and we would wipe him off the face of the earth. I really believe, that made him blink. As I mentioned in the book, I said he blinked, took a step back, and he built the Berlin Wall, and that shut off Berlin, and that stopped the crisis. But that's what it took. No, I've no doubt he was because think about it, it's like Putin today. I mean, he's got a bunch of bullies back in Moscow, and he has to prove himself to these guys. Otherwise, he's gone. So, and as we saw a year later, he got his next opportunity in Cuba, and he tried it again in Cuba. But by this time, I think, Kennedy and staff, all right, so despite all the chest pounding and getting on TV, I think the adrenaline was not quite as hot as it was the year before. So yes, it was very, very plausible that a war could have started because Khrushchev was not totally rational.
Yeah.
And he could do something crazy. He had been doing things that were crazy before. He's capable of doing that. So yeah, I think they all took him seriously. And all Monday morning quarterbacks that Khrushchev never done that. He should have known we would be stronger or this, that, and the other thing. That's Monday morning quarterbacking. There's not a doubt in my mind. Kennedy truly believed that Khrushchev was capable of launching, and if he did a sneak attack, all of those Monday morning quarterbacks had egg on their face because in one fell swoop, we would be nothing before Polaris.
That's the whole point, isn't it?
That's what made, and that's why Kennedy goes out to 85,000 people and says, I have an uncomfortable truth. I may owe more to these Berkeley guys than to Harvard, which is a hell of for a Harvard graduate, that's a big statement.
Yeah, you don't want to be saying things like that, do you? No, exactly. Well, listen, Tom, we're running out of time here. So this is fact, mind you, we could talk for hours, right? This is great. Okay, let's talk about you. We've talked a lot about history and we've talked about all these things, but your background is quite something, right? So obviously West Point, then you got MIT, you're designing nuclear weapons, in your spare time, I guess, and then working on arms control as well. I mean, how did your career
How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, how did you do that?
I think pieces fell together. It was no grand plan, Chris. Seriously, I had no. Even when I applied for work at a weapons laboratory, I remember thinking at the time, "Wait, I want the Nobel Prize. What the hell? I don't want to be a nuclear weapons designer." those goddamn things are dangerous. That's not what I dreamed about.
Yeah.
But what I told myself is, well, wait a minute. I do believe in deterrence. I truly believe that the only thing that keeps us from peace is having weapons that deter Brezhnev, and he's at the time, those idiots. And so it would be pretty arrogant of me to think, well, that's good enough for someone else to do, but not for me. And so that I did throw my hat. But at the time I accepted, I was offered a job at Fermi Lab for doing pure physics. But I did come out to Livermore. Well, California is a lot better than Chicago weather-wise, but other than the weather, it was important. I felt it was really important.
Yeah.
And so when I arrived at Livermore, they gave me a carte blanche to the sense of I could join any research group I wanted. And that's when I met this George who I mentioned earlier, who was a Holocaust survivor. But George is a character. He was funny, one of the smartest men I ever worked with.
Amazing.
And George, I says, well, George, what's your group doing? He says, well, Tom, he says, we're going to make a laser. I said, oh, I thought this was a nuclear weapons thing, but okay. Well, how are you going to pump the laser? That's physics talk for how are you going to get energy to make the laser go? So, oh, we're going to use a hydrogen bomb. I said, what? I said, what? I said, how do you? And I says, there is no laser. Once the hydrogen bomb goes off, there is no more laser. What are you talking about? Well, it's the speed of light. You're going to use the light to pump the energy in, and the light gets there long before the blast wave gets there. So you're dealing with less than a millionth of a second, I understand. But in terms of light, light goes this far, about a foot in 1 nanosecond. I mean, shit, I got time. So anyway, and he gets up on a blackboard and he's writing out these equations and we're having these discussions. And I went back to the division leader. I said, I want to work with George. That man's crazy. And so I became a designer for the X-ray laser, and that became, I remember once and Edward Teller was very much involved in this. I remember once I gave Edward a drive at the Nevada test site. He wanted to see the crater after one of our tests. And they asked me to give him, and so I said, sure. So I remember I had to help Edward into the car, hold him down. And then we're driving. And he's a really great speaker. He's a very likable guy. And so we had a wonderful 90 minutes going up to this crater, and he's telling me all these stories, and we start talking about the test we just did and it's a wonderful time. So it's kind of and anyway, he told me during that ride that he's going to go see President Reagan. He's going to right after he's going to go and see President Reagan and tell him we can take on the Russians now. We can destroy their thing. And I said, Edward, I don't think we did that much on the test. I mean, the evidence of what we were doing, we were a long way from Flash Gordon kind of stuff. It was a long way, but Edward he just had this incredible energy, positive energy. And sure enough, he goes around. Now I can't say directly that he said this to that, but I will say that a couple of weeks later, President Reagan gets on TV and announces Star Wars, I think, and the premier weapon was going to be the X-ray laser. So suddenly, I have all sorts of news. The division lead chose me, said he wanted me to be the spokesman for the program. I was on BBC. I was on the Nova programs, Frontline. CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, all these reporters coming, and I'm going meeting all these people, and Bill Broad, who is a science editor at New York Times, he wrote something about how this was done, and there was a bunch of BS. It was not true, and I had to tell all these guys, no, that's not the way it happens, and all that kind of. So anyway, I get involved in that, and the war is ending now. The Cold War is ending, and I guess because I had the gift of the gab. Remember my Irish grandmother with the Amashonic? Yeah. I could tell stories, and I swear to God, it gets me in more trouble. But anyway, next thing I know, I was asked, and I go off to the Forrestal building in Washington, D.C. That's the home of the Department of Energy, which succeeded the Atomic Energy Commission. And Vic, I worked for a really wonderful man, and he had me. I joined what's called the Scowcroft Committee, and they were coming up with what's the American position for the START 2 talks. And so I was there. And most of these people were political scientists, and they were not. And I had a Mac, I had an original Mac with 28 kilobyte Mac on a canvas bag. And I'm the only one there, but I brought my own Mac. I sat there and I put the little floppy drive in, and I would start doing some calculations. They would come up with ideas, and I started blowing down with one State Department guy. Anyway, I was the nerd. And I'd get up, you can't do that. Nope, that kind of crap. And Vic Alessi, who was my boss back at the Department of Energy, next thing I know, I'm writing 2-page summaries for the Secretary of Energy, Watkins, his name was at the time. They'd have NSC meetings with Scowcroft and the President Bush Sr. And I had to prepare Watkins, what is the Department of Energy position on the start things? And it was, now I look back on it, I said, geez, that's pretty important. At the time, it was Vic, he trusted me, and I did it. And I wrote, and I said, sir, in the next meeting, they're going to discuss low altitude trajectories, for example. That might be one. I said, what's the technical issues are if the bomb goes low enough, you can't attack it from outer space, whatever the technical issues are. And then I'd write the DOE position. This is what you say. And then, it's pretty good taste, and give it to them. These guys were not experts. They were and so I did that, and then I came back. And then a year later, I got sent back. My boss sent me back, this time to the Pentagon, and I became the legislative officer for the Nuclear Weapons Council. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946-54, they created originally what was called the Military Liaison Committee, and that's the official organ for the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, to tell the Atomic Energy Commission, this is what we want with a nuclear weapon. And that's how they transfer the orders. And now Congress changed the name to the Nuclear Weapons Council. So then I became the writer for that. And we would have 15 congressional hearings a year, and I'd have to write up. And this was U.S. nuclear policy I'm writing. And I'd pass it on to the principal, and then I'd have what we called a murder board, and because I'd call up the congressional staff and say, what questions you're going to ask? And they would tell me, these are the questions, and then I'd have to think of the answers, and then I'd have to brief the secretary, the assistant secretaries. Okay, they're going to ask you this question, and here's what you say. Stuff. It was it's amazing, but this is how stuff happens. I didn't plan it. I just fell into it. And during my course there, I realized that nuclear testing was ending. Senator Nunn, Congressman Kopetsky, Gephardt, I knew it was coming. And I said, shoot, what am I going to do when I go back to Livermore? I'm not going to have a job. Without testing, you can't design a nuclear weapon unless you have testing. And I said, shoot, what the hell am I going to do? And I thought, well, the new thing is going to be, how do I stop the Ayatollah from making an atom bomb? And I thought of ways to do that. And I started a program, excuse me, and it naturally fell in with the Department of Defense, and that became an incredibly successful program. I had and I had to work with chemical engineers, not physicists. So that was a challenge. No, teasing.
Yeah. Yeah, hang on a second. Chemists and physicists, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm making too long an answer, but as one piece fell into another, and then it was then that I was asked to write this history of how we developed a thing called the Robin, which I describe in the book, which became the modern atomic bomb. And it was Johnny Foster, Johnny Foster. And then Johnny, he came to the lab one time, he was committee, and he, excuse me, he wanted to meet with me at 4:30 in the afternoon. So I went over at the laboratory, wherever he was at this big committee. I said, Johnny, I said, look, it's 4:30. Let's go to my place, my house. We can have some wine while we talk. And he said, good idea. So I put him in my car, and we drove off to my house, and we're sitting in my backyard, right outside here on my patio. And he says, Tom, I want you to write my biography. And I look at him and I said, Johnny, what do you want me for? You can get anybody in the nation to write your biography. And he says, because you understand what I did, and I trust you. And you don't say no to Johnny Foster. And I mean, Johnny Foster, he graduated from McGill, which is the premier institute of Canada, #2. At the same time, he was captain of the gymnastics team, and he was going to the 48 Olympics, representing Canada in the Olympics. I mean, he's all around and he set a North American ski jumping record at a meet at Dartmouth College. I mean, this guy is to me, he's Superman. And he developed his group, and he developed the modern atomic bomb. And I go into more detail in the book. And I'm going to write his biography. And I'm right in the middle of writing this history book from Berkeley to Berlin, by the way. And I got nervous. How the hell? I says, this is bad enough. I'm trying to write this history book. Now I'm supposed to write the biography at the same time. But I have a cabin, I call it, up in Lake Tahoe. We have a beautiful, and it's up and there's snow. And one winter day, it's so beautiful. And I went in the back room and pow, and I put out about 75% of that book, his biography. I had all this research in my brain, and I just, and eventually I did get it, but it's not commercial. The laboratory printed it. So they made a few hundred copies of it, or 1,000 copies, and we handed it out to laboratory people and to generals and admirals and stuff. But sorry, it's not commercial. But that was a pleasure working with Johnny and and that's when I really got to know his personality and what kind of man he was.
Yeah. Oh, incredible. Well, we really are getting close on time now, but I'll tell you what, a penultimate question, I think, here. If you look at, I think you mentioned it earlier on, right? You mentioned particular state leaders. And I think we've always got to be concerned about nuclear proliferation nowadays, right? But not in the same way, I don't believe, as we used to. So in other words, not in a high-tech way. We always hear about dirty bombs and things like that. Is that really how nuclear proliferation is likely to continue nowadays, rather than somebody creating their own thermonuclear bomb?
In my opinion, Chris, it's almost ass backwards. Back in the 90s, we went through one. I met with congressional staff, and everyone, there was kind of a belief that if we just act good, just be good, if we pull back, we get rid of some atom bombs, we quit testing, we stop testing, then that would encourage people. Then, okay, we can relax now, and they'll not proliferate because they'll not feel the need. Well, we did. We went through that. What happened is proliferation accelerated. It didn't stop. It went on. That's when Syria, Libya, Iran, North Korea. They put on afterburners, and it accelerated because these regional despots, suddenly they were not being hemmed in by a Cold War anymore, and so it had exactly the opposite and effect. And worse, President Bush, at the behest of Colin Powell, and I know because I was close to all this, Powell did not believe in tactical nuclear weapons. He said the only need for a nuclear weapon is strategic deterrence, and that's to stop an invasion over the North Pole. A bunch of missiles coming over the North Pole. Okay, we'll use it for that, but that's it. And so Bush Sr., I called it the Thursday Night Massacre. He got rid of all of our tactical weapons. Now, in the Army, in Europe and in Korea, I slept. Like in Korea, I was about 800 meters from a Quonset hut that possessed nuclear weapons, some of which I had control over. And that made me sleep nice and easy because I'm 12 miles away from the North Korean border. I'm right near the DMZ. And, Kim Il-sung was the idiot at the time, this idiot's grandfather. He's the guy that started the Korean War in 50. He's still in charge. And he had 1/10 of his population was in the army. And it was a huge army. And the only thing that allowed me to sleep at night was knowing we had the equalizer, because all we had was the 1 division, 2nd Infantry Division. And I was 2nd Engineer Battalion Coming Command. And my job was to stop these guys. Yeah, right. So the only thing that made me feel comfortable was the equalizer. And similarly in Europe, the order of battle was Russia had 97 Warsaw Pact divisions. We had 4 divisions. The British had 1 division up by Hamburg. Germans had a corps, maybe 2 corps, maybe 2 to 4 divisions, and the good French had a brigade, then Baden-Baden by the casino, the gambling casino, and that was it. That was it, and there was no doubt they could overrun us. The Red Army was huge, except we had nuclear artillery. God bless Johnny. We had nuclear artillery the warheads were designed by Johnny. We had 80 atomic demolition munitions, which I had control over, also invented by Livermore. And they were the equalizers. They committed us. And suddenly, when you pulled those things out of those countries, first thing Japan asked, well, would the United States really risk going to World War III over an invasion of Japan? I don't think so. And so now they're now seriously talking about starting up their own atomic program in Korea. And then Korea's asking that. We used to have nuclear weapons there. There was no doubt about our commitment. But now there is doubt about our commitment. And of course, there's Sweden, Germany, and well, France was always, but in Sweden, would the United States really, and after recent events, I think lots of people should be asking questions, would the United States really come to our aid? And that raised, without that visible commitment, what they called extended deterrence, that's gone. And I think that was an unforeseen consequence of this political cult or credo that just behave well and everyone else will behave well. And no, it's not the way the world behaves. You're always going to have these bully men, these despots who, when they see an opportunity, will take it. And I'm afraid that's what we're seeing. We're seeing India-Pakistan tensions building up again. Now we got North Korea going bazookas. And what's going to happen with Indonesia and with the Philippines? China basically taking over the Philippine Sea. So there's all sorts of, and I'm afraid a lot of that is over weakness. If you show weakness, it's not the way, so the world is not a bunch of us sitting around looking at crystals in a dark room singing Kumbaya. I mean, that's not the way it works. You're going to have these evil people, and it does take, you do need to deter them. So my opinion, in my personal opinion, you got to deter, but it's you have to do a very careful act in which you don't overdo it. You don't provoke violence in any way, but you do come up with make it a credible belief by an aggressor that if that aggressor does something, has nothing to do but lose, he'll lose. And that you have the commitment to that. You're not going to start a fight, but you sure as hell will finish one. I mean, that's that balance we have to do. I think the problem they were having, they thought President Reagan or some American president would start World War III, for whatever reason, especially with Reagan. I remember during the Reagan years, there was a common belief that Reagan couldn't wait to start pressing buttons to wipe out the evil empire and all that. And that was their scenario. We need to prohibit a Reagan from starting World War III. And that was a driver. And so we need to behave nicely. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, but that doesn't work.
No, this is the thing. I mean, when you're talking about tactical weapons as well, that sort of jangled something up here as well. Because so what you're saying is that Colin Powell was, and I guess the tactical weapon program was removed, but you've got different types, as you kind of alluded to there, of tactical weapons, haven't you? You've got like the tactical missile weapons, right? So I don't know, but you've also got the tactical very small weapons, right? Which I guess what you were talking about in Korea, where if you've got to stand up against you're being vastly overwhelmed by other divisions, that's what they would have fallen back to. And so without that protection, then it makes sense that they've got to proliferate, doesn't it?
Yeah. I'll share with you, at the Pentagon, I was there during the Gulf War, 91, 92. And following the war, some U.S. Army officials interrogated Iraqi officers. And there's a town called Kafji. And right before the outbreak of actual warfare, we were building up our forces in Kuwait and not Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia. And excuse me, there was this little bay near the town of Kafji, and we were we were unloading military stores, and they used the 82nd Airborne Division guarded this harbor. So it's a single division guarded it. 5 miles away in Kuwait, the Iraqis had 2 armored divisions and a mech infantry division. I mean, they had a mechanized corps facing, and 82nd is a light division. It has no tanks or anything. They jump out of airplanes. They don't come in with tanks. Yeah. So the question they had, why on earth didn't you take this mechanized corps and just attack a division, a light division? And the answer that they got was they were afraid of our nuclear artillery. The Johnny had built a nuclear shell. It's not a big yield, but it worked on the 155 howitzer, which is gaining a lot of publicity in Ukraine right now. But right. For the 155 howitzer, we developed the nuclear weapon for that. And the Iraqis were certain that we would use them against the Iraqis. And so they didn't dare attack us. So there is a case of deterrence working. And it just reinforced, those, because a lot of people are saying, well, these things are worthless. They're so low in yield. But they accomplished, they saved the 82nd from a god-awful bloody battle.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Exactly. Yes, okay. They may be low yield, but they still have their uses, right? So
They had
yeah,
what they called human wave attacks, you know. The last thing you want to do with one of those things around is put all your troops together and start. That is not a good idea. And if you have a nuclear artillery shell looking at you.
no, exactly. Okay, final question now, Tom. I'm really sorry about this, right? But you're going to have to be quick on this one as well.
Right.
Oh, reasonably quick. If you could leave your readers with one key takeaway then from your book From Berkeley to Berlin, what would that be?
Okay. First thing, there are two things. First is that a lot of people would recognize and understand and know the story of some great heroic people who back in the 1950s, at the very outset of the Cold War, they accomplished some great things that enabled us to get through the Cold War without going through a nuclear exchange. And their story is, that we would understand and know their story is great. And I think that would really make me happy that these individuals would be recognized. So that's number one. Number two, I think that some of the things that they faced back in the 1950s with this now growing threat coming out of the Soviet Union, and how we responded, and how President Kennedy acted, and how everyone worked together to do that, and how we used political scientists to work with physicists to come up with, you know, clever, good ideas.
Yeah.
That there are parallels to today's world with Putin and Xi Jinping that we could learn from. That the way we handled those crises back then could be a nice blueprint for how do we handle things today. And so that would be the second thing I think maybe we could take from that. And that would be I'd be happy.
Yeah, well, I think though, if you read the book, you would come away with those 2 points. So that's great, Tom. And yeah, we are now out of time, unfortunately. But oh dear. Well, that concludes today's episode of the BrightWord Books podcast. We've been speaking with Tom Francis Ramos, author of From Berkeley to Berlin: How the Rad Lab. Do you know what? Honestly, I'm so excited about it. I can't say it even. I can't even say it properly, Tom. So you're the author of From Berkeley to Berlin: How the Rad Lab Helped Avert Nuclear War. Now, listeners, if you'd like to learn more, be sure to grab a copy of his book and visit his website at www.physicsandhistory.com for additional insights into the history of nuclear science and international security. Honestly, the mixture between the two, the juxtaposition of either of those, is actually just amazing. So, Tom, thank you for joining us today. Everybody else, you got no problem. But be sure, everyone, to subscribe to the BrightWord Books podcast so you never miss an episode featuring authors who shape the way we see the world through their words. So until next time, keep reading, keep learning, and keep discovering. And Tom, you are a fascinating person with an absolutely fascinating history, and it's been a complete pleasure talking to you today. And I hope we talk again soon.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.